A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Book the First. Recalled to Life. Chapter 1. The Period. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Though it was the worst of times, it was also the best of times. The times were the worst, but they were also the best. The best of the times was also the worst of the times. It was the times. The best times were the best and the worst times were the worst. Though the best of the times were the best and the worst of the times were the worst, it was still the best of times and it was still the worst of times. The times were the worst and the best and also the best and the worst. The worst times were worse than the best times, but the best times were the best compared to the worst times. The times were the worst and the times were the best. It was the best of the worst of the times and the worst of the best of the times. At times the times were the best. At times the times were the worst. At times the times were the times. At times the best times were the times. At times the worst times were the times. At times the best of times was the worst of times. At worst the best of times were the best and at worst the best of times were the worst. It was the best of the worst of the times. It was the worst of the best of the times. It was the best of times, but it was also the worst of times. The times were the best and the worst. It can be said that it was the best of the times. It was the worst of times. It was the times. The best was the worst. The worst was still the best. The best was still the worst. Best or worst, it was still the best of times. It was also still the worst of times. The better times were the best. The worst times were the worst. The worst was the best. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the best worst times. It was the worst best times. The times were the best. The times were the worst. It was the best of the worst of the times. It was the worst of the best of the times. It was the times. Though the best of times were the best, it cannot be denied that the worst of times was the worst. It was the times.